printer was running out of cyan and yellow. And if it runs out, then you can't print. So I'll be in real trouble. But I gave you a map, a chart. I hope you can read it. Why? Because we're going to talk about what I'm going to try to do, what I've been trying to do with these classes is instead of doing the regular, what I usually like to do in these classes, I like to start out with, the historical, an introduction to cultures. Because ancient cultures are different than modern culture. If you didn't get the idea already, if you're going home to eat meat, you're going to have meat today, and it's not a festival day, then you understand. And even the church festivals, right? The church festival days, as meat became more ubiquitous, that's what people ate. So, in the ancient world, things are different than they are in the modern world. And so I want you to really understand it. So I'll try to keep reminding you of that. But the next thing that I always go into is the veracity of the text. So we've proved the veracity of the text. We know that we can trust Acts. And did you guys see in the paper today? In the paper was the thing about the eyewitness. The headline, of course, is eyewitness accounts can't be trusted. And then it was a story about the guy they just executed, which they most rightly, I think, executed. I'm glad he's croaked because he was a bad and evil person. And even the supporters said he should be in jail for life. But maybe he didn't act so heinously when he killed the guy. But that's all right. Eyewitness accounts can be trusted. And the more you have, the better, right? So, it's interesting how the world is trying to convince you that eyewitness accounts aren't good, right? It becomes a headline issue. If eyewitness accounts aren't good, then we have a serious problem with all of history. We have a serious problem with our own realization of the world. So if you want to go the Immanuel Kant route, you remember Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is a philosopher. And he basically proved God by saying that your perception of the world can't be trusted. And Immanuel Kant was a Christian philosopher. So if you want to go Kant, and Kant was being, I'm not going to say he was being facetious, but do you see what he was trying to do?
Take away their argument.
He's trying to take away their argument. That's exactly right. Because the argument of the philosophical world is and what is what? You guys know it. What is the argument of the world about all of the issues that, to a certain degree, we find dear? If I can't prove it with science, it doesn't exist, right? And I've already showed you that science is only one of the triad of the ways to know truth. You have scientific method, you have legal historical method, and you have logic. So you have multiple methods of knowing truth, and scientific method is only one of them. So if you rely on the scientific method, how much can you prove? Not a whole lot. So you've got to rely on the other methods. But the big deal with this is that what did the world in the age of reason tell people? You can't know truth except through science. And Immanuel Kant took away that because he said, everything you perceive in reality is not right. And he uses as a proof of God, which, by the way, still stands. It's probably the best proof of God there is. But in any case, digressing into philosophy is always good because this is, it's not opinion, right? It's really important to understand how all these things fit together. So based in veracity, we showed how the book of Acts can be viewed as good history. Not just good history, it's the best history we have for the period, so that's a good thing. Or the book of Colossians, looking at Colossians, the New Testament documents. I'm teaching a class in Acts too, so I just finished that part. The next thing I like to do is go into historical prelude. Because if you don't understand the history of the times, you're just not going to be able to understand what's going on. But you know that, right? I mean, if you read a letter out of context from the Civil War, how much you can understand about that letter? Johnny went off to Gaithersburg, and he saw 100 people die around him. If you don't understand that's in the Civil War, what are you going to think, right? So to understand Colossians, you've got to understand part of the period the history of the period. And that's why I give you this chart, this map. Because this explains, in large measure, the history of the period. Let's do the words of the day. The way this is supposed to work, the way I want to do this class, the way I did it before, is I want to basically give you the focus of the session or lecture in the beginning, and then get into part of Colossians so that we can actually start looking at the text kind of in reference to it. So we'll remember these words because we'll come back to them. This is one of my favorite words because of its mistranslation. It's K-E-P-H-A-L-E, Kephela. Kephela. Kephela, what's Kephela mean? Kephela is roughly translated as head. But you got to realize how the Greeks view head. We think of head as a head, right? It's a head. But in the Greek worldview, remember I told you Greeks think geometrically? In the kephela, the word kephela used as head, literally comes from the word meaning to seize. To seize. So why do you think the word to seize became the word head?
Control the guy's head, you control his body.
That's precisely right. As a matter of fact, the word kephela is a military term in Greek. So the word kephela is used in the context specifically of a wrestler. What do wrestlers do when they're wrestling? Right? And they stick out their head. Why? Why do they stick out their head? If you're a wrestler and you approach like this, what's going to happen? You're toast, right? Matter of fact, if you're on remember the wrestling positions, there's two main wrestling positions, right? Well, maybe ladies don't, but us guys had to go through wrestling class in school, right? We all had to wrestle. And so, remember wrestling, there were two. You started up, right? And you always started leaning over with your head forward, right? And when you were on the ground, you always started with what? On one knee with the guy's arm, kind of around your head, right? Well, the reason is because kephela, to seize the head, literally is a wrestling term and also a military term. Because when you're in warfare, what do you stick out to prevent the bad guy from, basically what are you doing when you're sticking your head out? You're protecting yourself. You're protecting the guy next to you. So the word kephela, head, the context of kephela is in Greek, is always to protect. That is, and so whenever you see the word head, generally, it means to protect. So for example, my favorite mistranslation in the New Testament is that God is the head of Christ, as Christ is the head of man, as man is the head of his wife or woman. What that literally means in the Greek is God protects Christ as Christ protects men, as a man protects his wife. It doesn't mean head as in English. In English, there's a connotation by head to mean the leader, right? The headship. That is not in Greek. That is a gross mistranslation. They should have never used the word head. It's horrible translation. But we find it everywhere. And it's used to justify all kinds of weird, in my opinion, weird ideas about a human interaction. But in any case, that's the point of learning a little bit about Greek and trying to understand Greek. Here's another word that's really interesting. Eklesia. S-I-A. And remember, I tell you, I always put it in the context. If you're out reading your interlinear, if you look at the word, it's ekklesias, ekklesia. I'm not teaching declensions of nouns, verbs, etc. from the Greek because it's too complex. But ekklesia. Ekklesia, grossly translated as. Anybody want to take a guess? Well, it's translated as church. But this word is the Athenian democracy. Democracy. Athenian democracy. That's what this word means, ekklesia. Ekklesia literally means called out. You notice in the translation I gave you from the Strong's Vines, it says a popular meeting. Okay, that's not a great translation, okay. I don't like Strong's and Vines for the fact that they interject their own cultural opinions. Because in Greek, okay, in Greek, Ecclesia always means the Athenian democracy. Always. Until when? Until what? Until Christianity. And then all of a sudden Christianity borrows this word. Why did they borrow the word the Athenian democracy?
Because everybody knew what it was.
Everybody knew what it was, and what are the characteristics of the Athenian democracy? Why didn't they use the word synagogue? Synagoga is Greek. Who uses the word synagogue? The Jews. Well, tin hodos, a bunch of Jews, right? Guess what? They still use the word synagogue, but they use the word ecclesia to mean those in the synagogue who were followers of tin hodos, right? Christ, followers of Christ, but tin hodos. They were called out of the, what were they called out of?
Jews.
The synagogue, right? The synagogue, the definition of synagogue, and I should have given you the word, synagogue, synagogia, synagogue, synagogia, synagogia, I think, something like that. Anyway, sun means what? Together. This is leader. What is a synagogue? It's a meeting that has a leader. What is an ecclesia? A meeting that is called out. Does it have a leader? Is there a leader in the Athenian democracy?
Christ.
No, there isn't. It's peerless. It's peerless. Matter of fact, you elect. What they did is they elected a king. Every year or so, I don't remember what it was, but they elected a king. The democracy wasn't a democracy like we think. Do you know how they chose the members of the democracy? That gets really deep. By lot. They chose them by lot from the demi. They weren't chosen by vote. But they were voting members. The ecclesia was a voting group. They were peerless. They had no peers within the group. They could make life and death decisions for the Athenian democracy. They were the highest power in the Athenian democracy. So, you might ask yourself the question, why they called themselves the ecclesia? Because that's a critical point. I'm not up to logos to telos yet. Logos. What's a logos? A logos is an argument to a telos, an argument basically in Greek. In fact, I gave you the words. Let's see what I say in here. Logos. This word is translated say or said, but it doesn't mean, it's sometimes translated word too. But logos is literally an argument to relate by argument, to try to convince you of something. This is when they say, the Socratic dialogues are a logos. And remember, I've given you the words before. I'm not going through the whole list, but there's a whole list of words that can be translated say or said or word in Greek. This is one of them. And by the way, it's not a good translation to translate this as word. What book translates this as word all the time? The book of John says, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This is not a mistranslation. Well, it is a mistranslation in English, but not into Greek, because it comes from the Septuagint. The Septuagint, remember I mentioned the Septuagint last week? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. Because in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it says, in the beginning was God, and God, the Spirit, the Ruach of God, rested over the waters, and God logosed. So therefore, in the beginning was the Logos. And actually, translating this as word is bad. It should be in the beginning was the argument that created. Do you see how that's Greek? The argument that created. The Word of God created, the argument that created. And therefore, in the beginning was the argument that created, that we attribute to the being of Christ. Yeah, Christ. In the beginning was God, and the Word was with God. That is, the argument was with God. In other words, what is the connection that John's trying to make between the beginning of time and John? Jesus was always there, and he was the argument of God. Because the next word is exactly that argument, the reaction to the argument. P-I-S-T-E-I, pistis. Remember I told you I give it to you the way it is in the thing. But pistis. Pistis means to be persuaded. But we translate this word all the time as faith. Okay. I don't like translating pistis or pisteo as faith. I think that's really bad because the word in Greek does not mean faith as we understand faith. Pisteus, piste, means to be persuaded. Be persuaded of what? A logos. And the argument being Christ. This is so important. Do you see how this fits? As we see this in Colossians, we're going to see the logos to telos. In other words, the argument to the conclusion. I get to logos to telos eventually because we've got to talk about Greek, development of Greek. This is the last word. E-U-C-H-A-R-I-S-T-O-E-M-E-N. Euchristomen. Euchristo. Forget that declension. Euchristo. Euchristo, our word, what comes from this? Eucharist. Eucharist. It is, in my opinion, it's grossly mistranslated in many cases in the New Testament documents because the word means literally EU charis. Anybody want to venture a guess? EU means good. Whenever you see EU, euangelion, you whatever, Eucharistos, it always means good in Greek. EU is good. Remember this for your SAT, ACT test you're going to take, because it's right on, it's going to be on there. U means good in English and in Greek as a prefix. Charis means grace. It's translated grace, but it means graciousness, and it also implies a benediction in thanks for a meal. Good benediction. For a what? A meal. So therefore, Eucharist, why do we use the word Eucharist to define the call to communion? Because it's a good meal, right? Whenever you see the context of Eucharist, Eucharistos in Greek, it's an implication, especially in the New Testament, to the what? To communion and the Eucharist, which is another thing we'll get into. In any case, let's talk a little bit about the time and the history. I gave you a picture. Let me get to my notes on it. I gave you a picture. Let's talk about 400 BC to 0 AD. We got the Greeks. The Greeks rule the world. The Greeks, city-states, and they're city-states. Did I give you Greek? Is there much Greek in there? Yeah, there's Greece in there. When we think of Greece, we think of Greece, right? But it ain't Greece. What is it? It's like about 10 or 12 city-states. You got Thebes, you got Athens, you got Sparta. You know, each of them have their own language-ish. Not quite language, but you know what I'm talking about. It's like southern versus northern, right? It's Midwest versus Western. A little bit deeper than that because they actually use different words because these are semi-isolated city-states. Each is a political entity. In the ancient world, there are not nations. There are no nations like we conceive nations until something happened. But even then, in the nation, when there is beginning to be nations, the world is still city-states. Why? You can only control what you can control. There's no rule of law. So what you can control is a city-state that has what? Usually these things have walls around them, and you can have your army in them. There's not police forces, right? We talked about that already. You got armies. And so the armies aren't keeping the peace. They're preventing dissent. They're preventing attacks. They're preventing whatever. And I can control what I can control. So what did you do when you defeated a city-state in the ancient world? Well, you knocked down the walls. In Athens, that's what happened. In Athens, in 400 AD, 400 BC, the death of Socrates, when Sparta defeated Athens, what did they do? They leveled the walls. And Athens could not become a power again until they could rebuild the walls. Because a city-state relied on its walls. Guess what's around Jerusalem in the ancient period? Walls. Guess the first thing the Babylonians did when they took Jerusalem? They knocked down the walls. Remember rebuilding the walls in Zechariah and Ezekiel? Was it Zechariah, Nehemiah and Jeremiah? Nehemiah and Jeremiah. They're rebuilding the walls. So in the ancient world, the city-states are what you could control. Nations are just kind of a different thing. What you did to build a nation is you controlled the city-states, and that's the way the world acts or is. So in the ancient world, in the Greek world, the Greeks invented these things that I've talked about before. They invented through Greek philosophy, scientific method, legal historical method, and logic. So we've got these Greek views in the world. I've already talked some about this. The big deal, let's just think about this. Remember all those things I talked about being Grecian, being Greco-Roman, being Greco-Judaic. They apply. Now, think of this. Basically, in 3, someone might get this date, 336 BC. Anybody want to venture what happened in 336 BC? One of the most important and defining events in ancient history. I always made my kids, I should have made my kids remember this date. I always made them remember 60 BC. That was when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and it was the end of the Roman Empire. But I should have made them remember this one. That's when Alexander the Great took control of Macedon from his father. He basically captured the world until 323 BC when he died of an illness. So how many years is that? Anybody calculate that out? It's about, 13 years? In 13 years, he basically conquered the world. This is the beginning of the history of this entire period. This is the beginning. This is why the New Testament is the way it is. This is why the New Testament's written in Greek. Because in these 13 years, from 336 BC to 323 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the world. And the thing was that when he conquered the world became Hellenized. The world became Greek. And I talk about the known world. And you got a picture. That's the picture I gave you right here.
Why don't they call it Alexanderized?
Alexanderized. Because he didn't live long enough. It was Hellenized because the Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek gods, Greek architecture, Greek everything. That's why you can go to all these cities. You go to cities as far as India, and guess what you see? Greek art, Greek architecture, Greek city layouts, Greek gods, Greek everything. As a matter of fact, from this period of time, look at Egypt. Egypt is Greek. The Seleucid Empire is Greek. That's Persia, Turkey, Greek. It's all Greek. You ever wonder why all those cities that were Greek-speaking cities that were evangelized by the early Kenotos were all in Asia Minor, that is Turkey? They're all Greek. It's Greek, the Greek world. The world is Greek. And by the way, outside of the Greek world, or outside of what Alexander the Great conquered, guess what happened to the rest of the world? Think. Put your ancient thinking caps on. Okay, I'm an ancient person, and this guy conquers the whole world. What's my opinion? What about this guy's gods? They must be the most powerful gods around. What about his philosophy? What about his ideas, his architecture? And, he's bringing basically not running water. The Greeks weren't really, they liked baths, but they weren't into running water like the Romans pretty much. Romans built aqueducts. The Greeks built, wells and, things over springs. They're pretty smart there. So you have to cart the water. The Greeks kind of built the Romans kind of built where they wanted. The Greeks built where it was convenient. So that's pretty cool. But, the Greeks were great idea people. The Romans were great producing people. Very interesting the way whole civilizations kind of focused. So guess what? The Greeks couldn't hold on to what they had. A lot of it was technological difficulties, but the big deal was when Alexander the Great died, his generals split the world into 3 pieces. Seleucus Seleucus, I never say his name right, produced the Seleucid Empire. Seleucid empires being Asia Minor and Persia. Who was Macedon? Philip? Anyway, in Macedon, whoever the general was for Macedon, he kept the name Macedonia. That's cool. But what was his name? Did I write it down here? Ptolemy. Ptolemy took over Egypt, and sometimes that's called the Ptolemaic Empire, right? Egypt, Ptolemy. Kind of funny how in the modern world we still call it Egypt, but we call it the Ptolemaic Empire for a long time. But anyway, so you have the three generals, one in Egypt, Ptolemy, one in Asia Minor, Seleucid, the Seleucid Empire, and then Macedon. So you have three different empires from the Greek Empire. And guess who's coming up as a world power? The Romans. The Romans. And so the Romans begin eating at, especially Macedon. They conquer Macedon in, let's see. The Roman Republic established in 509 BC. City-states were with Romans apart. They became a world power in about 200 BC. The problem with Rome is Rome was fighting for years. Who were they fighting? Anybody remember? Man, this is like, what do we teach with history? Man, we got to start teaching this world history stuff, because this is really important stuff. What was bugging the Roman Empire for years?
Was it the Gauls and the Germanians?
No. They were just
with the elephants.
the guy with the elephants. Who was the guy with the elephants? Hannibal was
Hannibal the Great.
Carthage. Carthage is a bunch of idiots or a bunch of smart guys. Either way you want to think about it. Okay, they fought 3 wars with the Romans. The first Punic War, the second Punic War, and the third Punic War. Okay, look. The Romans were bit by a gnat. Actually, they weren't. The Carthaginians were pretty bad guys, okay? I won't go into great detail, but I've talked before about them. The Carthaginians were pretty much well, I guess I should talk. You guys ever heard of the boat people? Not the boat people, what do you call them? The sea people from the Mediterranean Sea, the Heliconos, the guys they tried to take Egypt. They went to Phoenicia. They're the Phoenicians. They became the Phoenicians. The guys that borrowed the Philistines. Remember the guys who bothered Samson on the coast, right? Guess where they settled? They settled where the Egyptians kicked them out. They went to the Levant and settled the coast of Levant, and so they bothered the Israelis for a long time. Still did. They were also in Carthage. Carthage was in Tunisia, which is on the coast of Africa, and they were biting along the coast of Sicily and the coast of Egypt, or coast of Greece. So these sea people are the guys who became the Carthaginians, and they were kind of a real problem for the Roman Empire. If anyone who ever says that war doesn't solve problems, the Romans finally solved the problems of the Carthaginians. Anybody know what they did? They took Carthage to the ground, took every stone off every stone, and salted the ground with the bodies and salt. They killed every Carthaginian in Carthage. There's no more Carthaginians around because the Romans exterminated them. One of the reasons they exterminated them, and this is one of my favorite things in this, is because they had a top fit. The Romans found a top fit. Anybody know what a top fit is? We have archaeological evidence of 2 top fits in the world. One in Carthage and one in Jerusalem.
The burning places?
A top fit is a place where you kill, you sacrifice children. The Carthaginians like to sacrifice kids. I don't know why. Seems kind of stupid to me. But they would sacrifice children. And so the Romans, when they found in Carthage a top fit, a place for infant sacrifice, basically decided that these guys, toast. And they did. They toasted them. So finally, with the defeat in the last Punic War of the Carthaginians and the total